The body bag moved when I stopped at the red light. At first, I told myself it was just the straps shifting in the back of the hearse. But when I looked in the rearview mirror again, one of the zipper flaps was slowly folding back open by itself. Tonight's archive contains 3 accounts from people who worked around the dead for years: a funeral transport driver, a morgue technician, and a night security guard. All of them believed the same thing before these nights happened: that the dead stay where they're supposed to. I worked funeral transport for almost 3 years when this happened. Most people think the job is creepy, but honestly, after a while, it just feels routine. Quiet roads, paperwork, hospitals at strange hours, and long drives with nobody talking in the passenger seat. Most nights were uneventful. The dead never bothered me. The living usually did. I worked for a small funeral home outside Knoxville, Tennessee. We covered a lot of rural areas, so sometimes I'd spend hours driving empty highways through the mountains to pick someone up from a hospital or nursing home. Most of the time, I listened to late-night radio or baseball reruns just to stay awake. That night started around 1:30 in the morning. I was sitting in the funeral home garage, finishing coffee from a vending machine that tasted burnt enough to strip paint. My boss, Richard, walked in holding a clipboard and told me there'd been a pickup request from a hospice center about 40 minutes away. I remember him looking annoyed more than anything else. Rain had been coming down steadily all night, and nobody liked driving Hollow Creek Road in bad weather. Too many blind curves. Too many deer crossing at night. Richard handed me the paperwork and told me the family wanted the body transported before sunrise. I grabbed my jacket, headed out to the hearse, and started the drive. The rain was light at first, mostly mist hanging over the road. The farther I got into the hills, the thicker the fog became. Headlights barely reached past the next curve. The windshield wipers made that dull rubber squeak every few seconds. The hospice center sat at the end of a narrow road surrounded by trees. It looked almost abandoned at night, except for one glowing window near the entrance. A nurse let me inside and walked me down a quiet hallway that smelled like bleach and stale coffee. Most of the lights were turned off. The patient had passed maybe an hour earlier. Elderly male, natural causes, nothing unusual. The nurse apologized because the freight elevator was broken, so we had to use the smaller side entrance near the loading ramp. She helped me move the body onto the stretcher before disappearing back inside. That part always felt strange to me. 1 minute there are people around you talking softly, and the next you're completely alone with the silence. I loaded the body into the back of the hearse and closed both rear doors. I remember double-checking the straps because the roads out there were rough. One of the metal buckles kept sticking, so I had to pull harder than usual to secure it. Before leaving, I stood outside for a second listening to the rain hitting the roof of the vehicle. The woods around the hospice were completely dark. No streetlights, no traffic, just trees and fog swallowing everything beyond the parking lot. The drive back started normally. I kept the radio low and followed the winding road through the mountains. About 15 minutes into the trip, I noticed another vehicle behind me. At least I thought I did. Every now and then, I'd see headlights appear faintly through the fog, then disappear around curves. At first, I didn't think much of it. Hollow Creek connected to 2 rural highways, and truck drivers used it sometimes to avoid interstate traffic. But after another 10 minutes, I realized something felt off about the lights behind me. They never got closer. No matter how slow I drove through the curves, the headlights stayed the exact same distance back, not gaining, not falling behind, just there. I remember adjusting the rearview mirror twice trying to get a clearer look. Rainwater distorted everything behind me. Most of the time, all I could see were 2 pale lights floating through the fog. Eventually, I came to the only red light on Hollow Creek Road. It sat at a small intersection near an abandoned gas station that had been closed for years. Half the sign had burned out long before I started working that route. You could still barely read the word gas through the flickering letters. I stopped at the light and rubbed my eyes. I'd been working long hours that week and figured exhaustion was making me paranoid. The headlights behind me vanished completely once I stopped at the intersection. That's when I heard the sound from the back. A dull metallic shift. Not loud, just enough to make me look into the rearview mirror automatically. At first, everything looked normal. The interior was dark, except for faint reflections from the traffic light above me. Then I noticed one of the zipper flaps on the body bag moving slightly. I stared at it for several seconds, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The hearse had stopped hard enough that maybe the straps shifted. Maybe air escaped from the bag somehow. Then the zipper moved again, slowly, like someone dragging it open from the inside. I felt every hair on my arms stand up at once. The red light outside reflected faintly through the rear glass, and I could clearly see the zipper pull sliding downward a few inches at a time. I remember whispering "nope" out loud to myself like that. Somehow made the situation less real. The second the light turned green, I hit the gas harder than I should have. The tires slipped briefly on the wet pavement before catching traction. I kept checking the mirror every few seconds while driving faster than normal through the curves. The zipper had stopped moving, but now the body bag looked slightly different. It took me a second to understand why. The upper part of the bag looked raised. Not much, just enough that it no longer looked completely flat. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe I hadn't secured the body properly. Maybe the road caused the straps to shift upward. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The shape under the bag looked wrong now. Higher, like the shoulders were elevated slightly. I grabbed the radio microphone connected to dispatch and almost called Richard, but I stopped myself. What exactly was I supposed to say? That the corpse in the back looked like it moved? The road ahead narrowed into a section surrounded by dense trees on both sides. Fog drifted low across the pavement. I remember feeling trapped inside the hearse, like the road had suddenly become much longer than usual. Then something hit the rear door, a single heavy thud. I physically jumped in my seat hard enough that the vehicle drifted toward the shoulder for a second. The sound came again a few moments later. Slower this time. Thud, like someone weakly striking the inside of the rear doors. I don't mind admitting this now because enough time has passed, but I was close to panicking. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely keep the hearse straight on the road. Then the rear cabin light flickered on by itself, just once. But it was enough. For maybe half a second, the back interior illuminated clearly in the mirror, and I saw that the body bag was sitting upright. Not fully upright, more like someone halfway sitting up after waking from sleep. The zipper opening had widened enough for me to see pale skin underneath. Then the cabin light died again instantly. I slammed on the brakes so hard the hearse skidded sideways slightly across the wet road. I don't even remember making the decision. Instinct just took over. I threw the vehicle into park and stumbled out into the rain. I stood there breathing heavily beside the road while cold rain soaked through my jacket. The woods around me were completely silent, except for the ticking sound of the hearse engine cooling. For almost a full minute, I couldn't bring myself to open the rear doors. Finally, I forced myself to walk back there. I remember my hands shaking against the metal handle. I opened the left rear door first. The body bag was lying flat again, completely flat. The zipper was fully closed, exactly the way I remembered securing it back at the hospice center. The straps hadn't moved either. Everything looked perfectly normal. I stood there staring for several seconds while rainwater dripped from my hair onto the pavement. I kept waiting to see movement again, but nothing happened. Then I noticed something that still bothers me years later. The inside of the rear glass was covered in condensation, and written through the fogged glass from the inside were 3 words: "Not this road." Most people assume the fear comes from seeing the dead, but people who work those jobs long enough usually stop being afraid of bodies. What really stays with them are the small things that don't make sense afterward. Sounds from locked rooms, movements they can explain away during the moment, and details they only start questioning once they're finally alone again. And honestly, if you were driving through an empty road at 2 a.m. and saw words appear on the glass behind you, would you keep driving, or would you stop and look inside the back one more time? I worked as a morgue technician for about 6 years at a county hospital outside Louisville. Most people hear that and immediately assume I spent every shift terrified, but the truth is the opposite. After enough time around death, the fear fades into routine. Bodies become paperwork, procedures, temperature logs, and long nights under fluorescent lights. A morgue itself sat in the hospital basement below the surgical wing. You reached it through a service elevator most visitors never even noticed. The walls down there were painted this pale green color that somehow made everything feel colder. The air always smelled faintly like disinfectant mixed with old metal. Night shifts were usually quiet. That's why most senior staff hated taking them. Hours passed slowly underground. Half the time I'd spend entire shifts organizing intake forms or checking refrigeration units while listening to sports, radio through one earbud. The only other person working that night was Dr. Levin, one of the overnight pathologists. He was older, probably in his 60s, and barely spoke unless necessary. Around midnight, he told me he was heading upstairs to grab coffee and review paperwork in his office for a while. That left me alone in the morgue. Honestly, I preferred it that way. At around 12:40 a.m., an ambulance arrived through the lower loading entrance with a John Doe pickup from a highway accident. Male, mid-30s maybe. No ID found at the scene. The EMTs looked exhausted more than disturbed. One of them joked that I was lucky because at least my patients never talked back. The body arrived zipped inside a black transport bag already soaked from rain. Apparently, the accident happened during a storm on Interstate 64. I signed the intake forms while the EMTs wheeled him inside. One of them mentioned the victim had been found wandering the shoulder before being struck by a truck. That detail stayed with me for some reason. People don't usually walk interstate shoulders alone after midnight in heavy rain. After they left, I moved the body into processing. Standard procedure. Photograph belongings. Document visible injuries. Secure personal effects. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed constantly while I worked. Somewhere deeper in the hospital, machinery hummed through the walls. The victim's injuries were severe enough that I tried not to look directly at his face too long. That happens sometimes in morgue work. You learn where to focus your eyes, hands, clothing, paperwork, anything except the parts your brain keeps replaying later at home. The strange part started while I was inventorying the victim's belongings. There weren't many, no wallet, no phone, no keys, just wet clothing and a small folded piece of paper inside his jacket pocket. At first, I assumed it was trash stuck to the fabric from the accident scene. The paper was soaked through and partially torn. I unfolded it carefully under the light. Written on it in shaky handwriting were 4 words. "Don't let me sleep." I remember staring at the paper for several seconds, trying to understand what I was looking at. It didn't feel like a suicide note. It looked more like something someone writes to themselves while panicking. I eventually placed it with the rest of the personal effects and continued processing. That should have been the end of it. About 20 minutes later, I wheeled the body toward cold storage. The refrigeration room sat at the far end of the morgue, behind thick steel doors. The temperature dropped noticeably the second you stepped inside. Rows of storage drawers lined both walls from floor to ceiling. I opened drawer number 8 and slid the body inside. Then I locked the drawer shut. I know I locked it because I physically remember hearing the latch click. Afterward, I returned to the main workstation and started finishing the intake report. The entire morgue had gone silent, except for the sound of my keyboard and distant ventilation fans moving air through the building. A few minutes later, I heard metal scrape loudly from the refrigeration room. Not a bang, more like heavy metal dragging against metal. At first, I assumed Dr. Levin had returned without me hearing him enter. I called out asking if he needed help, but nobody answered. The sound came again, longer this time. I stood up slowly and removed my earbuds completely. The hallway leading toward refrigeration looked darker than usual. One of the overhead lights flickered weakly near the entrance. I walked toward the room expecting maybe one of the storage drawers hadn't closed properly. The refrigeration door stood slightly open. I was absolutely certain I left it closed. Cold air drifted into the hallway, carrying that sterile metallic smell morgues always have late at night. I stepped inside and immediately noticed drawer number 8 hanging partially open. Not fully, just enough to leave a narrow black gap. I stopped walking right there. People love making jokes about morgue workers being fearless, but there's an important difference between working around the dead and seeing something impossible. My brain immediately started trying to rationalize it. Maybe I didn't shut the drawer all the way. Maybe the latch failed. I walked closer and grabbed the handle. The drawer slid open easier than expected. The body bag was still inside exactly where it should have been. But the zipper was open now. Open down to the chest. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. I knew for a fact I'd sealed it completely earlier. I even remembered checking the zipper twice because the bag material kept snagging near the shoulder. I stared at the opening for several seconds before finally forcing myself to pull the zipper shut again. That's when I noticed the hands. They weren't folded the way I remembered. Now they rested flat against the sides of the bag. I stepped back automatically. Maybe that sounds ridiculous, but morgue workers remember positioning. You spend years moving bodies carefully. Small changes stand out immediately. I told myself rigor mortis shifting could explain it. Maybe transport movement. Maybe I simply remembered wrong. I closed the drawer harder this time and physically tugged on it twice to confirm it locked. Then I left the refrigeration room. I didn't even make it halfway down the hallway before the lights flickered. Every overhead light dimmed simultaneously for maybe 2 seconds. During that moment, I heard 3 loud knocks echo from inside refrigeration. The sound froze me in place, not because it sounded supernatural, because it sounded deliberate, like knuckles hitting metal from inside one of the drawers. I stood there staring at the hallway floor, trying to decide whether I wanted to go back in. Part of me already knew which drawer the sound came from. My brain didn't even bother pretending otherwise. Then the phone at the workstation rang suddenly. It was Dr. Levin upstairs, asking if I could bring him a file from pathology storage. I interrupted him halfway through and asked if he had been downstairs at any point during the last 10 minutes. He sounded confused and said no. I almost told him everything right there. Instead, I just said one of the refrigeration drawers may have faulty latches. He told me maintenance could check it in the morning. Then he hung up. I remember standing there afterward, feeling embarrassed at myself. I was 31 years old working in a hospital basement and letting exhaustion get into my head, so I forced myself to go back into refrigeration one last time before retrieving the file. The room felt colder than before. Not physically colder, quieter colder. I immediately looked toward drawer number 8. It was closed. For a second, I actually laughed nervously to myself. I remember thinking the whole thing was turning into one of those stories coworkers tell new hires to mess with them. Then I noticed something on the floor. Wet footprints, bare footprints, leading from drawer number 8 across the refrigeration floor. I followed them automatically with my eyes. They stopped directly in front of me. Not faded, stopped. Like whoever made them had simply remained standing there. I slowly looked up toward the dark reflection in the steel storage doors ahead of me, and for a second, I genuinely thought someone was standing behind my shoulder. I spun around immediately. Nobody was there, but when I turned back toward the reflection, I noticed something worse. Drawer number 8 was open again, and this time the body bag inside was empty. Most people assume morgues are frightening because of the bodies. But after hearing enough stories from people who actually work there, that never seems to be the part that stays with them. It's always the smaller things. A drawer that was definitely locked. Footsteps where nobody should be standing. A body changing position when nobody else was in the room. And the worst part is that every single detail always has a logical explanation, until all the explanations stop working at the same time. But think about this for a second. If someone really did die terrified of falling asleep, what if the last thing keeping them awake was fear itself? And once that fear is gone, how do you know something else didn't wake up instead? I worked overnight security at St. Mercy Memorial for almost a year before I quit. The hospital itself wasn't particularly dangerous. Most night shifts were painfully boring. You walked empty hallways, checked locked doors, answered the occasional disturbance call, and tried not to fall asleep around 4 in the morning when the entire building went quiet. The basement was the worst part of the job. Not because I believed in ghosts or anything like that. It was just uncomfortable down there. The morgue level sat beneath the oldest wing of the hospital, and unlike the newer floors upstairs, the basement still had these long, narrow corridors with yellowed walls and dim fluorescent lighting. Everything echoed down there. Even your own footsteps sounded wrong. Most guards avoided spending more time there than necessary. We all joked about it, but every overnight worker had at least one weird story involving the morgue hallway. Usually it was harmless stuff. Doors opening by themselves. Elevator calls from empty floors. Motion alarms triggered in locked rooms. The older guards loved telling stories during smoke breaks outside. One guy named Walter claimed he once saw someone standing at the far end of the basement corridor after midnight. He said the figure looked like a patient wearing one of those hospital gowns. According to him, the person disappeared once he got closer. Nobody really believed him. Walter also believed energy drinks caused memory loss, so his credibility wasn't exactly strong. The security office sat near the emergency entrance on the first floor. Most of the shift involved staring at monitors while hospital staff moved through the building. Nurses grabbing coffee, cleaning crews pushing carts, ambulances arriving through the bay doors. After enough hours, you stopped paying attention to individual faces. That night started normally. I came in around 10 p.m., grabbed coffee from the cafeteria, and took over for the evening guard. He mentioned one thing before leaving. Camera 4 had been glitching again. He told me maintenance planned to replace it later that week. Camera 4 monitored the lower basement hallway leading toward the morgue elevators. I remember joking that maybe Walter's ghost finally learned how cameras worked. The other guard laughed and left. Around midnight, the hospital became unusually quiet. Storms had rolled through earlier, so fewer people were coming into emergency. Even the ambulance traffic slowed down. Most of the monitors showed empty hallways and dark waiting rooms lit by vending machines. At about 12:45, I noticed movement on camera 4. At first, I thought it was static distortion. The image quality down there was terrible already. But after watching for a few seconds, I realized someone was standing near the far end of the hallway. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there facing the camera. I leaned closer to the monitor, trying to make out details. The image kept flickering slightly, but I could tell the person looked thin, maybe male, wearing what looked like a hospital gown or patient clothing. My first assumption was dementia patient. That happened occasionally during overnight shifts. Elderly patients wandered where they shouldn't, and confused staff had to track them down. I picked up the radio and asked if any nurses were missing a patient downstairs. Nobody answered immediately. I kept watching the monitor while waiting for a response. The figure still hadn't moved, not even slightly. Something about that bothered me almost immediately. Real people shift their weight eventually. They scratch their face. They look around. This thing looked completely frozen. Finally, a nurse from the 3rd floor answered saying all patients were accounted for upstairs. I looked back at camera 4. The hallway was empty now. No walking away. No movement. Just gone. I remember sitting there for a second debating whether to physically check the basement or ignore it. Most guards avoided unnecessary patrols downstairs late at night because the corridors felt creepy enough without your imagination helping. Eventually, I grabbed my flashlight and headed down anyway. The basement elevator opened into the older section of the hospital, where this walls still carried that faded green paint from decades earlier. The air always smelled colder down there somehow, like wet concrete and disinfectant. My footsteps echoed loudly while I walked toward the morgue hallway. Nothing looked unusual. No patients wandering around, no open doors, no movement. I stopped near the exact position where the figure had been standing on camera 4. The hallway ahead stretched another 50 feet toward the elevator lobby near refrigeration storage. Half the overhead lights buzzed softly above me. That's when my radio crackled. Dispatch asked if I was downstairs. I answered yes. There was a short pause before the dispatcher asked, "And who's sitting at your desk?" I stopped walking immediately. For a second, I honestly thought the dispatcher was joking. I asked what he meant. He said one of the monitors upstairs showed somebody sitting inside the security office with their back facing the cameras. I felt my stomach tighten instantly because I knew I was completely alone downstairs. I told dispatch to call the other guard still on exterior patrol and send him upstairs immediately. The dispatcher asked if I wanted him to contact hospital staff too. Before I could answer, something metallic slammed loudly somewhere deeper in the basement. The sound echoed violently through the corridor. I swung the flashlight toward the noise automatically. At the far end of the hallway near the morgue elevator, something moved briefly behind the corner. Not quickly, slowly. Like someone leaning backward out of sight. I remember feeling frozen in place for a second, trying to process what I'd just seen. Every rational thought in my head kept telling me it was another employee. Maybe maintenance, maybe a nurse. But no employees used that hallway after midnight unless they absolutely had to. My radio crackled again. The exterior guard had reached the security office upstairs. Nobody was inside. The chair behind my desk was still slowly spinning. I actually felt cold when he said that. Not scared exactly. More like my body suddenly realized something was very wrong before my brain caught up. Then the basement lights flickered, not completely off, just dim enough that the hallway ahead briefly disappeared into shadow. And during that moment, I heard footsteps, bare footsteps, slowly approaching from deeper in the corridor. I backed up instinctively while shining the flashlight toward the darkness ahead. The beam shook slightly because my hand wouldn't stop trembling. The footsteps stopped immediately. The hallway became silent again. I remember saying out loud, "Hospital security. Who's there?" No answer. Then my flashlight beam landed on the elevator doors. Someone had written something across the steel surface. At first, I thought it was condensation or dirt. But as I stepped closer, I realized the words looked smeared by a hand. "I see you too." I literally felt my chest tighten reading it. I backed away from the elevator slowly, without taking my eyes off the doors. That's when the elevator indicator lit up above me. Basement level. The elevator was coming down. I remember hearing the cables moving somewhere inside the walls. The old elevator groaned loudly while descending toward the morgue floor. I told myself over and over it was probably hospital staff. But deep down, I already knew something felt wrong. The elevator finally stopped. The doors opened slowly. Nobody stood inside, just an empty elevator lit by pale fluorescent lights. And sitting alone on the floor inside the elevator was a black body bag. Water dripped slowly from the bottom onto the elevator tiles, like it had just been dragged through rain. I stared at it for maybe 3 seconds before noticing something worse. The zipper near the head area was partially open, and from inside the opening, I could hear someone breathing. Hospitals always say the overnight shift is perfectly safe. Quiet hallways, locked doors, security cameras everywhere. Supposedly one of the most controlled environments you could possibly work in. And honestly, maybe they're right. Maybe camera 4 was just malfunctioning. Maybe the footprints, the moving drawers, and the breathing inside a sealed body bag all have completely reasonable explanations. But if that's true, then here's the real question. Why do so many people who work night shifts in hospitals eventually stop looking directly into reflective surfaces after midnight? And why do experienced guards always seem to avoid the basement elevators when they're alone? Most people spend their entire lives trying not to think about places like these. Morgues, basement corridors, funeral transports driving empty roads after midnight. We tell ourselves the dead are silent, that once a body is zipped shut or locked behind a steel drawer, whatever made that person who they were is already gone. But tonight's accounts all seem to circle around the same disturbing idea. Not that something came back from the dead, but that something may have already been there before death ever happened. If these stories stayed with you, subscribe and return to the archive for more realistic horror every week. And before you leave tonight, look carefully at the final screen. There are 2 more stories waiting for you there. And after what you heard tonight, hospitals and empty roads might not feel quite as different anymore. Because maybe the strangest part isn't what people see in places connected to death. Maybe it's how often completely unrelated people describe the exact same things afterward. The same warnings, the same figures standing still in empty hallways, and the same feeling that something is quietly watching them, waiting for them to finally fall asleep.